Imran Khan, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Marc.
Right now, Pakistan is in the midst of an economic crisis. Do you think the current government is equipped to handle it?
Well, Marc, knowing the aftermath of the coronavirus, it disrupted all supplies, and there was this commodity super cycle. Prices went up, inflation went up all over the world. So my government had very delicately balanced all this. And we managed to keep the prices down, and the sentiment was good because our industrial growth and our agricultural growth was going very well. So when this regime change took place, the market lost confidence. So what we are watching right now is a meltdown. Our currency has lost almost 10% of its value. Stock exchange has crashed. Prices have gone through the roof. Inflation is now about 30%. So the country is facing challenges right now.
You've led several protests over the past few weeks. What exactly are you trying to achieve? Are you not concerned that the protests will add to a sense of chaos?
Well, the chaos was when, Marc, this what we call the US-backed regime change took place in Pakistan. And so my government was replaced by a government, 60% of the cabinet is on bail. These two families have been ruling Pakistan for 30 years. So my government was the first time we replaced this two-party system and we came into power. Now, the parties that were fighting, contesting against each other, both have joined hands and are in government. But they're facing massive corruption cases. And so what has happened is that these people have come into power. Rather than having a roadmap to fix the economy, all they're doing is trying to get rid of their corruption cases of billions of rupees. So they are completely incapable of handling it. All we want is, we just want elections. We want free and fair elections so that let the people of Pakistan decide who should run the country rather than a US-backed regime change.
You have repeatedly claimed the US backed your removal from office. What evidence do you have of that?
Well, yes. On 7th of March, the US Undersecretary of State, Donald Lu, he meets our ambassador in Washington and actually threatens him that unless Imran Khan, is removed through a vote of no confidence, there'll be consequences for Pakistan. And if I'm removed, then all will be forgiven. Now, this is this American official threatening our ambassador. An ambassador in an official meeting, minutes were taken. He sends this cipher, which I see, this coded message, which I see. I place it in front of the cabinet and in front of the National Security Council, which then decides to send a démarche to the US, protest to the US for this blatant interference in our affairs. And the President of Pakistan has sent it to the Chief Justice of Supreme Court to hold an inquiry, because on 7th this cipher comes, this threat. On 8th, the no confidence motion is tabled against me. And then suddenly, our allies and 20 of our members of my party start jump ship. So, and then we have evidence that the American embassy was meeting some of these disgruntled members of my party even before this no confidence motion was tabled. So all we want is an inquiry into this, because we feel there is blatant evidence of regime change. Actually, also in the cipher, the US Undersecretary tells our ambassador that my trip, the Prime Minister's trip then to Russia, they were disapproved of, and I think that became the bone of contention, which is why this regime change conspiracy took place.
The State Department have denied they pushed for regime change. If what you're saying is true, why would they have denied it?
Well, I think it'll be extremely embarrassing. The State Department clearly, or this Undersecretary, Donald do, clearly did not think this would become public. Because, look, he threatens the ambassador. And now we have the official communique, which is the cipher. And the big question is, who is he sending this message to? Because I was the Prime Minister, I'm the Chief Executive, I had the Foreign Office, so who was this ambassador being, what message was being conveyed? So that's number one. And I would imagine that they would be very embarrassed. Because in US, if people find out, I mean general public finds out, that this is we are the 5th most populous country in the world. And if this is how a US official deals with Pakistan ambassador in an official communique. So I think that I would expect them to deny it. But we have the communique, we know the dates, we know there were note takers on both sides.
Elections are scheduled for next year, so if you are so confident of your support for re-election, why not just wait for those elections?
Because Mark, this is insulting for a country of 220 million people, that an elected Prime Minister is removed by this conspiracy. And we know what the conspiracy was. Let me just say, Pakistan is not the first country where the regime change by the US has taken place. We know in Central America, or South America, regimes were changed. We know in Chile this happened. In Iran in 1950s, we know exactly the similar sort of regime change took place in Iran in 1950 when Prime Minister Mossadegh was removed. All the same things happened. The money was spent on media, which then vilified the Prime Minister. Then the opposition was doing demonstrations against him. And then his own members of his parties were bought. And so, and that's how they toppled him. Exactly the same pattern took place here.
No Pakistani Prime Minister has ever finished a term in office. And I'm curious as to why that is and why the role of the military is so significant.
Well, let me just, so in the last 62 years, half the time we have been ruled by military and half the time by these two families. They've ruled us. So I'm the, first time it's a new party has come up. Now, two things. Number one, whenever governments in Pakistan were removed, they were always removed on corruption. This is the first time a government is removed when we had one of the best growth rates, economic performance, and that's reflected in the economic survey of Pakistan. We were going probably our best industrial production, agricultural production. We were growing to sustainable growth is the word. So this is the first time a government has been removed when there were no corruption cases and you couldn't doubt the economic performance. And since we've been removed, the country's gone down. As for the military, you see, we first, when Pakistan came into being, there was a big threat. India was 7 times bigger than Pakistan. And we immediately had a small skirmish or small war with India. Since then, there was fear in Pakistan that, we have a neighbor 7 times the size and we have to defend ourselves. So the military got stronger. The military, we became a security state. And hence the role of military grew in our country. But recently, there's a consensus that, a poor democracy is better than a military government.
Do you ever think there'll be a time in Pakistan when the military won't have such a huge influence?
I think, at the moment, we have so far, this is now, 13 years of democracy. We had 9 years of military before. And I feel that days of military ruling Pakistan are over. I think there's as I say, that there's a consensus in the country that even a poor democratic government is better than a military government, because what happens is that when the military intervention takes place, we go back to square one. We then again have to start our evolution as a democracy. So that's why our democracy has not so much flourished as yet. our democratic institutions haven't got stronger because we go back to square one when the military takes over. So we are in the process really of strengthening our democratic institutions.
Just coming back to your economic track record, you were in Russia when it invaded Ukraine. You were there to negotiate oil prices as part of your attempt to deal with the economy. That said, looking back on that moment, being in Russia, do you regret being there at that particular moment?
Mark, it's not a question of regret. Look, the trip was planned long before. There was a consensus in Pakistan. All stakeholders felt that we need to improve our relationship with Russia. Because in the Cold War, we were in the Western camp, and India was a neutral, non-aligned, but was closer to the Soviet Union. So there was a feeling in Pakistan that we should improve our relationship with Russia, because economically we have Russia can. What is the word? We need Russia more economically as far as our gas, because our gas reserves are depleting. Secondly, we need wheat because we have a growing population, and we had some 2 million tons of wheat shortage in Pakistan. And then the military needed hardware from Russia, and now we needed oil from them because Russian oil, we were going to get 30% discount from Russia to buy oil. So that was the primary need for us. So the timing turned out to be bad, because last thing I would have realized is that the night I land there, the next morning, President Putin decides to go into Russia. Now, I wasn't supposed to know that. And from that point of view, the timing turned out to be bad. But as I said, I wasn't supposed to know that.
I'm actually quite fascinated by what you think the biggest challenges Pakistan is facing right now. Like, what is not being focused on in the midst of all this? Is it health? Is it climate change? What are the issues you think need to be addressed right now?
Mark, there are lots of... Right now, the economic issue is the biggest issue. And as I said, we had very delicately balanced our economy because of this commodity super cycle when all energy prices had gone up all over the world, and 25% of our imports were oil-related, petroleum imports. So when the prices went up, it was a very delicate balance for us because we inherited basically a bankrupt economy. We only had reserves for 3 weeks of our imports. So we built it from there, and country went through pain the first year because we had to go into an IMF program. We had cut our expenditure, so people suffered. Then came COVID, so the whole world suffered COVID. But in the third and fourth year, we grew at 5.6%, and then at 6% in the fourth year. So the economy was taking off. Our GDP had gone up, and so we were moving towards sustainable growth. But always we realized that if there was a political shock, it was so fragile that it would go into a tailspin, and that's what happened. The moment this regime change took place, our currency started falling, our reserves have depleted, and we have, because we depend on imports, and the moment the currency fell, the inflation has hit the roof. So at the moment, we are in a very difficult situation.
At the moment, do you have any indication from foreign governments that they would support you returning to power?
Mark, I don't want any support from foreign governments to get into power. I want free and fair elections. Let the people of Pakistan decide whoever they think is best to govern the country.
Just looking now at the India-Pakistan relationship, a couple of weeks ago we had the Indian High Commissioner to Australia, Manpreet Vohra, on the show, and he said that Pakistan sponsored terrorism and that they won't deal with Pakistan until Pakistan deals with that. I'm curious, do you have a response to that position?
Well, this is a standard line by India, because you see, where is the terror? What has happened is that Kashmir, which became a disputed territory between Pakistan and India in 1947, the countries went to the United Nations. the United Nations Security Council passed resolutions that the people of Kashmir, through a plebiscite, should decide whether they want to stay with India or with Pakistan. That was 74 years back. India never gave them that right to decide their destiny because they knew that people of Kashmir would vote to join Pakistan. Since then, this area has become troubled because within Kashmir there has been a movement, for independence. The movement actually is that they would just want independence. Now, in 1989, this then turned into an insurgency when they rigged the elections in the valley to have a pro-Indian government. There was a popular uprising. Since then, 100,000 Kashmiris have died. And in 2019, on 5th of August, India took away the statehood of Kashmir, which was the special status given to Kashmir until a plebiscite took place when the people decided which country they wanted to join. Now, since then, first the people of Kashmir were put under siege by 800,000 Indian troops, and 9 million people were in a state of siege. And since then, India blames, or even before that, they blame Pakistan for whatever happens, any incident that takes place in Kashmir, they blame Pakistan for it. The answer is not blaming Pakistan. The answer is to give the people of Kashmiris the right that was guaranteed to them by the international community, let them decide their own future. So to stop that, they have used the strong arm tactics, they've used military, it's the most militarized area in the world. I mean, the soldier ratio to the population is probably the highest. So India keeps blaming Pakistan for what happens in Kashmir. We believe that it is an indigenous movement, and if they were given their right, this whole thing would pacify. The area would become pacified.
There are many people that regard the Taliban as a terrorist organisation, and you've been accused of cultivating a friendly relationship with them. In fact, there's actually a nickname for you, which is Taliban Khan. I mean, what is your response to people that say you have too close a relationship with a terrorist group?
First of all, let me just correct something. Taliban were never terrorists. Taliban were religious fundamentalists. The organization that was considered a terror organization was Al-Qaeda. Now, Taliban came into being in 1996. I mean, I'm just giving people a history so that they know what this Taliban is all about. When the Soviets left Afghanistan in 1989, Afghanistan went into chaos because the Soviets left, the US, which was, along with Pakistan, was sort of fighting this war of independence at the time against the Soviets. The US packed up and left. Afghanistan went into chaos. The Mujahideen groups who were fighting the Soviets then carved out Afghanistan. There were warlords, they had influence in different areas. 200,000 people in Afghanistan died in the civil war that followed. And in that chaos, 7 years later emerged the Taliban. Why did the Taliban sweep Afghanistan? Because they gave a chaotic Afghanistan a sense of rule of law. They established a rule of law. They brought peace to Afghanistan. Now, they were fundamentalists. They were religious fundamentalists, not terrorists. Now, when the US replaced Taliban in 2001, the regime change took place. I was one of those people who knew the history of Afghanistan, along with all those people who understood Afghanistan, the character of the people. We kept saying that there was not going to be a military solution. People of Afghanistan never accept outside interference. The British had experienced this in the 19th century. The Soviets, in the 20th century, all had failed to control Afghanistan, an outside force, because this is their history. They are the most independent-minded people. So I kept saying that there was not going to be a military solution, and there wasn't. Anyone who opposed this military solution became pro-Taliban. So because people didn't understand the situation. they do not understand the character of the Afghan people. So, in the end, when people like us were proved right, somehow we were made to be sort of friendly with Taliban or sympathetic with them. People like us are sympathetic with the people of Afghanistan. Afghanistan has suffered 40 years of strife. If any nation needs peace, it's Afghanistan. So all of us who stood for peace in Afghanistan did not mean that they were affiliated to Taliban. The military was never going to be a solution. And right now, you have Taliban as a reality. The world should work with them because there is no other reality in Afghanistan now. And in my opinion, the more you engage with them, the more you will bring them into the mainstream of the world.
Do you believe that Pakistan today supports terrorist groups?
Look, Marc, how did we end up in this position? In the 80s, when the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan, Pakistan became a frontline state. All the Western countries, specifically the US, helped Pakistan, and we trained these mujahideen groups, the ones who were freedom fighters in Afghanistan. They were trained along the border on the Pakistan side of the border of Afghanistan. They were trained to go and do guerrilla activities. They were called heroes, ones who do jihad, freedom fighters. Come 2001, the US invades Afghanistan now. Now, these people who were trained to do jihad or freedom struggle or who were guerrillas, Pakistan now tells them that, look, this is because the good guys have come to Afghanistan, which is the US, it is no longer jihad. If you fight them, it's terrorism. So guess what happened? They turned against Pakistan. These groups, which were trained to, were indoctrinated that fighting a foreign invader was jihad and you were heroes, suddenly we are telling them that they're terrorists, and Pakistan joined the US war on terror. So these people turned against us, and Pakistan lost 80,000 people for joining the war, the US war on terror. We had 3.5 million people internally displaced. We had over $100 billion lost to the economy. The US ally, Pakistan was an ally, conducted 400 drone attacks into Pakistan. So Pakistan was the country that suffered the most joining the US war on terror. And we became the collateral damage of the US war in Afghanistan. So not only did we suffer, because these groups turned against us, suddenly they became terrorists. So we then became a country that had terrorist groups. But these people were heroes when they were fighting the Soviets.
Okay, so do you believe then that the Taliban are the right people to be governing Afghanistan?
Marc, this is not the question right now. Question is, have we any choices? Is there another group that can manage Afghanistan? The US-backed government of Ashraf Ghani, I mean, they had all the resources in the world. They had US aid coming in. There was 300,000 army in Afghanistan trained by the US with the latest equipment, the best armed army. And what happened in the end? 70,000 armed, lightly armed militia. These 300,000 troops surrendered to them. And why did they surrender? Because the people of the country of Afghanistan supported the Taliban. Why did they support them? They didn't think of them as Taliban. They thought of them as freedom fighters. And they thought of the puppet government, the US-backed puppet government, was isolated. Which is why 300,000 troops surrendered without a fight. Because the population, army cannot go against a population. So the population had moved on that. Why? Because the Ghani government was considered extremely corrupt, isolated. They did not deliver to the people. In the rural areas, people's lives didn't change at all. It was only in the urban areas, which were only 3 or 4 cities. So therefore, my answer to your question is, let the people of Afghanistan decide who they want. And I feel that the people of Afghanistan are strong enough, eventually they will assert their rights. The women in Afghanistan will assert their rights. But never has it happened that some outsider can liberate women of another country. It's never happened in history. Let the people, give them a chance. They're strong people, and I think they will assert their rights.
There's lots of Pakistani Australians watching tonight. Do you have a message for the diaspora?
The biggest support actually since this regime change in Pakistan took place, it's never happened before that all the Pakistanis, when we have almost 9 million Pakistanis diaspora living in different countries, and never has it happened that they turned out in such large numbers to support us, to support me. It's never happened because normally when there's a regime change, there's celebration in Pakistan. People distribute sweets. This is the only time that people came out, and millions of people within the country and Pakistanis outside came out to protest. And so I consider finally that I consider the overseas Pakistanis living in Australia, they are one of our greatest assets. And they have, their remittances, when the money they send back to Pakistan, has been one of the main reasons my government, they send more money during my government than ever in our history. So, and that was the main reason why we were able to, our economy was able to grow, we were able to sustain ourselves despite our exports, although we had record exports, but our exports are far less than our imports. And until we raise our exports, this gap has been filled by the overseas Pakistanis' remittances. And so I, for one, am extremely grateful to this overseas community.
Just coming back to the relationship between India and Pakistan, what could improve relationships between those two countries? Like, what needs to be done right now?
Marc, there is only one issue between us, and that is Kashmir. And I find that it's just lack of leadership that we have not been able to resolve this issue. Because the advantages of peace in the subcontinent are enormous. Pakistan on one side has China, one of the biggest, fastest growing economy in the world. And then we have India on the other side, which is potentially one of the second biggest market in the world and economy in the world. And then on our other side, we have all the world energy reserves. We have Iran, and then we have Central Asia. So we are strategically placed. If we had peace with India, India then has access to all the energy corridors. It has access to Central Asia, land access. And on the other hand, Pakistan and India, we have access to each other's markets. So the dividends of peace are enormous. But unfortunately, it is all stuck in Kashmir. We have not been able to resolve this issue in 75 years. And in my opinion, it just takes determined leadership. If two can decide to sit down and resolve the issue, then this whole area will be transformed. And may I say that, the issue of resolving Kashmir lies with the people of Kashmir. Because right now, the tactics which India has in Kashmir are quite similar to what Israel has in Palestine. These are not, there's not going to be a resolution either between Israelis and Palestinians or in Kashmir. Because by just having troops and security and having the latest sort of methods of oppression, this is not a permanent solution. So eventually there will have to be a settlement in Kashmir where the will of the Kashmiri people, let them decide what sort of, what they want, what is their future. But, there's no other way. I mean, just by oppressing them is not the answer.
So are you calling for an independent Kashmir then? Is that what you're asking for?
I think that, if India and Pakistan can sit together, and I must say we tried, and work out what would be the best way you could allow the people of Kashmir to express their free will. And the three entities, Pakistan, India, and Kashmiris, they will come up with some solution. But First of all, there has to be a realization that in 75 years, just by oppressing them and using force, it hasn't worked. And this is not as I said, this is not a permanent solution. Permanent solution is letting them decide what they want to do.
Just lastly, before I let you go, you have had an incredible life. What would you most like to be remembered for?
Look, Marc, I've also been very privileged. I've had more love and respect in my country than hardly any other Pakistani. So my contribution to my society would be just that which I started my politics 26 years ago. And I have to say I was inspired by, when I first went to England as a teenager, the two things that inspired me about England: rule of law and a welfare state. And later on, when I studied my own history, the first welfare state in the history of mankind was made by our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the first state of Medina. This is exactly what he did. It was a state where he made it a welfare state. State took responsibility of the weaker section of the society, a humane state. And secondly, he established rule of law, meritocracy. And these are exactly the principles which I set out 26 years ago. This is what I want in Pakistan. My biggest struggle has been that the ruling elite, these two families that have ruled Pakistan for 30 years, they refuse to come under the rule of law. They believe they're above law. And this whole struggle has been that they've all ganged up and these massive corruption cases against them. They do not want them to be judged by the law of the land. They consider themselves above the law. And unless and until you have rule of law, in my opinion, I've been all over the world. If you look at prosperous countries and you look at failed states, or you look at states with massive poverty, there is only one difference: rule of law. The prosperous states always have rule of law. And that is the reason why you liberate the potential of a society. Unfortunately, in the entire developing world, you have might is right. The powerful can get away with murder. They can plunder the country, do whatever. This justice system cannot bring them under the law. And that's why there's this huge transfer of wealth. Every year, according to the United Nations Secretary General's panel called FACT-I panel, it estimates every year $1.7 trillion are illegally transferred by their corrupt ruling elites, transferred from these poor countries into rich countries, offshore accounts, big palatial places in London and Western capitals. And this is why the rich are getting richer, poor are getting poorer. So the big difference is rule of law. And that's really my mission.
Imran Khan, thank you so much for joining us on India Now.
Pleasure.